In the final years of American steam, the Pennsylvania Railroad built a locomotive that could sustain speeds no other steam engine in the country could match. With 80-inch driving wheels, a revolutionary duplex drive, and the aerodynamic styling of Raymond Loewy, the T1 class was designed to outrun the future itself. 52 were built between 1942 and 1946. Not a single one survived. Today, there is no T1 in any museum, no T1 on any pedestal, no T1 rusting quietly behind a fence. Every one was cut apart and sold for scrap. If this locomotive was so advanced, so fast, and so ambitious, how could an entire class vanish without leaving a single physical trace? The answer reveals a fatal engineering flaw, a corporate collapse, and the most devastating preservation failure in American railroad history. The Pennsylvania Railroad was not just another railroad. For nearly a century, it was the railroad. Headquartered in Philadelphia, the PRR operated more than 10,000 miles of track stretching from New York to Chicago, from Washington to St. Louis. Its main line, the legendary four-track corridor between New York and Pittsburgh, carried more passenger trains per day than any other stretch of rail on Earth. The company's annual revenues exceeded those of most nations. Its stock was the most widely held security in the world, and its engineering department, centered at the massive Altoona Works in central Pennsylvania, designed, built, and tested locomotives to standards that other railroads could only aspire to match. The PRR did not merely operate trains. It set the standard. Its rail profile, its signaling system, its bridge specifications became the benchmarks for the American railroad industry. The company's own motto, the standard railroad of the world, was not marketing. It was a statement of institutional fact, backed by decades of engineering dominance and financial muscle. But by the late 1930s, the standard railroad faced a threat that no amount of tradition could defeat. Airlines were carving into long-distance passenger traffic. Automobiles and the expanding highway system were pulling commuters and short-haul travelers away from the rails. The PRR's passenger revenues, once the bloodline of the company, began to slide. Railroad executives in the Broad Street Station boardrooms studied the numbers and reached the grim conclusion. If the Pennsylvania Railroad was going to compete for passengers in the post-war era, it needed trains that were not just comfortable, but fast. Dramatically, undeniably fast. The diesel-electric locomotive was already proving itself on other railroads, but the PRR's leadership was not ready to abandon steam. The company had invested decades and hundreds of millions of dollars in its steam infrastructure, from the coal docks and water towers along its main line to the massive Altoona Works complex, where thousands of workers depended on the steam economy for their livelihoods. A full transition to diesel would mean writing off those investments and dismantling a workforce that had no equal in the industry. The PRR wanted a different answer. It wanted a steam locomotive that could beat diesel at its own game. Speed, reliability, and modern appeal wrapped in a machine that would keep the Altoona shops running and the coal contracts intact. The search for that machine would produce the most ambitious, most controversial, and ultimately most tragic locomotive program in American history. The concept behind the T1 was radical, even by the standards of an industry accustomed to pushing boundaries. Traditional steam locomotives used a single set of cylinders to drive a single group of coupled driving wheels. The bigger the cylinders and the more driving wheels, the more power the locomotive could produce. But also the heavier and slower the reciprocating parts would become. At high speeds, those heavy rods hammering back and forth created a phenomenon known as hammer blow, a rhythmic pounding force that damaged track, wore out bearings, and placed strict limits on how fast a steam locomotive could safely travel. PRR's engineering department proposed a solution that would break the traditional formula. Instead of one large engine set, the T1 would use two smaller independent engine sets, each consisting of a pair of cylinders driving its own group of four coupled wheels. This arrangement, known as a duplex drive, promised to cut the reciprocating mass in half. Lighter rods meant less hammer blow. Less hammer blow meant higher safe speeds. In theory, the duplex could let a steam locomotive run at speeds that would destroy a conventional engine. The idea was not entirely new. The PRR had experimented with duplex principles on the enormous S1, a one-off prototype unveiled at the 1939 New York World's Fair. The S1, stretching 140 feet from end to end, drew gasps from visitors who marveled at its streamlined shell and Art Deco curves. But the S1 was too long for most of the PRR's infrastructure. It could not negotiate the tight curves and turntables on the main line. The T1 was meant to fix this, shrinking the duplex concept into a frame that could operate anywhere on the railroad. Baldwin Locomotive Works received the contract for the production T1 fleet. Raymond Loewy, already famous for redesigning everything from refrigerators to ocean liners, was commissioned to design the T1's exterior casing. Resulting was one of the most striking locomotives ever built. A streamlined shroud of welded steel wrapped the boiler and running gear in a profile that tapered to a sharp, angular nose. The shark nose, as crews would call it, gave the T1 an aggressive, almost predatory appearance. Photographs from the period show the engine gleaming in Brunswick green, its gold pinstripes catching the light, looking less like a machine and more like a weapon. Two prototypes, numbers 6110 and 6111, were completed at PRR's own Altoona Works in 1942 and put into service on the Fort Wayne Division for testing. The results were electric. In trial after trial, the prototypes accelerated faster and ran smoother at high speeds than any conventional steam locomotive in the PRR's fleet. Engineers who ran the T1 in regular service described an experience unlike any other steam locomotive. The acceleration was explosive. From a standing start, the T1 could bring a 1,000-ton passenger train up to 100 miles per hour in a distance that left diesel-hauled trains far behind. One engineer, quoted in a 1948 issue of Railroad magazine, recalled the sensation as something between flying and falling. You opened the throttle and the world moved. Speed logs from the Fort Wayne and Crestline divisions, now preserved in the Pennsylvania State Archives, document T1 runs at sustained speeds above 100 miles per hour over stretches of 20 miles and more. Some crews reported hitting 110, even 120 miles per hour on favorable grades, though these higher figures were never officially recorded by the railroad's own dynamometer car. The PRR, wary of the public relations risk of admitting that its passenger trains routinely exceeded the speed limits imposed by insurance underwriters and regulatory authorities, kept the most dramatic numbers out of its official reports. What the logs do show is a locomotive that could maintain 90 to 100 miles per hour with a full passenger consist over long distances, hour after hour, run after run. On the PRR's main line, where schedules demanded arrival times that left no margin for delay, the T1 was unmatched. No other steam locomotive in regular American service could sustain those speeds. No diesel of the era could accelerate as fast or recover as quickly from signal stops and speed restrictions. For a brief window in the late 1940s, the T1 was the fastest thing on American rails. Crews who ran them knew it. Passengers who rode behind them felt it, and the man in the Altoona engineering office believed they had proven that steam could still compete on the fastest main lines in America. The thrill was real, the pride was justified, but inside the machinery, behind the streamlined casing and beneath the thunder of the exhaust, a flaw was already at work. Every run at speed pushed the T1 closer to a reckoning that no amount of ambition or engineering skill could postpone. The first reports came from the road foreman. Engineers on the Fort Wayne Division began logging incidents of sudden, violent wheel slippage at speed. The T1 would be running at 80 or 90 miles per hour, pulling smoothly, and without warning, the driving wheels of one engine set would lose traction and spin freely. The locomotive would lurch, the cab would shudder. The engineer would slam the throttle shut, fighting to regain control as the wheels screamed against the rail. The whole event lasted seconds, but for the crew, it felt like the machine was tearing itself loose from the earth. The cause was embedded in the very design that made the T1 fast. The duplex arrangement split the driving wheel load between two independent sets of 4 wheels. Each set carried approximately 134,000 pounds of adhesive weight. half of what a conventional articulated locomotive with 8 coupled wheels would put down in a single group. With only 4 wheels per engine set, each wheel bore more responsibility for maintaining grip. If one wheel began to slip, there were fewer neighbors to compensate. The entire set could break loose in a chain reaction that was nearly impossible to control. Conventional articulated locomotives, like the Big Boy, used 8 coupled driving wheels per engine set, spreading the load and stabilizing traction. The T1's designers had traded adhesion for speed. Lighter rods and fewer coupled wheels meant less hammer blow and higher safe velocities, but they also meant a narrower margin of safety on the railhead. Wet rails, slight oil films, even variations in rail temperature could trigger a slip event. Crews learned to dread rain, dew, and the first hint of frost. The Franklin poppet valve gear added another layer of difficulty. While brilliantly engineered for peak performance, the oscillating cam system was far more complex than the traditional Walschaerts gear used on most American steam locomotives. Maintenance crews at the Juniata shops in Altoona found themselves wrestling with components